on behalf of the Institute, welcome you to this program. And I want to, if you have your program, you will have seen that there were 4 people joining me this morning, and it says something about the state of American politics that there are only 3, although they're the right 3, the best 3. We just improved it tremendously by keeping a guy off the stage. But the person who is not here is Josh Stein, who's the Attorney General of North Carolina. And what happened to him was that the state legislature in North Carolina decided that they were going to cut his budget by $10 million. They're voting on the budget this week. That means he would have to lay off, if they succeed, he'll have to lay off 123 attorneys who are the people who deal with opioids, who deal with consumer fraud, who deal with all the crime things that people rely on their attorney generals to do something about. So that says something about where we are. The panel happens to be, these 3 ladies are all members of the Rodell Fellowship of the Aspen Institute. What we do every year is we go out and we find 24 from the whole country, 24 top young political leaders in America, and noted for their intelligence, their civility, their thoughtfulness, and their idea about the ability for people to work together to solve problems. And I'm very proud of all of them. Let me tell you quickly about me and what we mean to do in this panel. America looks different from Boston or San Francisco than it does from some other parts of the country. We have a big mosaic in this country. And we have areas that have common challenges, and we have areas where the challenges are very, very different. We have communities that suffer while other communities prosper. Globalization means one thing in some parts of America, it means something else elsewhere. The tech industry and robotics mean one thing in one area, they mean something else in other places. And so one of the things that we at the Institute have been focused on is trying to look at these various political narratives in the country, at the mosaic of who we are really as an entire people, and talk about that. And so I am really delighted to have these 3 people here with me. We're here, Julie Fedorchak is Public Service Commissioner in North Dakota. Amanda Edwards, my cousin. Amanda is on the Houston City Council, and Ashley Swearengin just finished 8 years as the mayor of Fresno, California. And they come from different parts of the country, but they've all wrestled with these kinds of political realities with their constituents. And I know they may say this different. I'm going to turn this mostly over to them. But one of the things that I realized when I've talked to people in our program from all over the country, that sometimes what you see everybody talking about in Washington is not necessarily what would make the top 20 list if you were in some other parts of the country saying, what's the real challenge, what's the real problem, what do we have to deal with? My own story is I came from Oklahoma and represented Oklahoma in Congress, but then I left and I went to teach at Harvard, which happens to be in Massachusetts. If you don't believe Oklahoma and Massachusetts are different planets, you don't understand. So we're trying to see how we bring all that together. So I'm just going to start. What are what's going on in your community? Are people there hopeful? Are they worried about the future? Do they see the future disappearing, or are they dealing with challenges that perhaps other people in other parts of the country don't quite understand what they're dealing with? How are you being affected by the new kind of wave of what jobs are out there and what training that requires, the opioid epidemic, other things that are happening? So just start with telling us, we'll get to other things, and we'll get to you too. But tell us a little bit. I'll just start with you, Julie, from almost Canada. Tell us what.
Yes, and you'll probably hear that in my voice.
Yes.
The almost Canada. Well, thank you, Mickey. First of all, thanks for the invitation to be here, and thank you to the Rodell fellows and those folks that make that program possible. It's really an amazing program, and I've been honored and really appreciated the opportunity to be part of it. And especially honored to be here today to talk about this subject, which I think is near and dear to everybody's heart. In North Dakota, I think our folks walk the line between extremely optimistic about the future and the potential. Our state's biggest economic drivers are agriculture and energy. And both of those have seen some, it's like a new day in agriculture and energy made possible by technology. But then we're also, extremely optimistic and see a lot of promise and potential. You kind of waver between extreme peril as well, because both of those industries are extremely dominated by the global market. So we're affected by those kinds of things. And then there's a lot of interest in both of those industries that drive our economy, and outside interests tend to have a huge influence on our economy. We saw that with, for example, the Dakota Access Pipeline. And that pipeline is a major part of the energy industry in North Dakota, and I would argue for the whole country. And what happened as a result of a lot of conversation around that pipeline and a lot of misinformation, quite honestly, that we can avoid later talking about. But so I think that there's great technological advancements. There's amazing things going on in those industries and in others that I think a little quiet state like North Dakota sees opportunity that we've never seen before. At the same time, we see these outside forces and a lot of other things. The drug epidemic has hit our state as well. In fact, I asked my kids that very question, what are you most worried about? My 11-year-old said, drugs. Even in little old North Dakota, Bismarck, North Dakota, which you would think would be very sheltered from that, that was high on his list of priorities. Not that he was going to be affected by it personally or get into drugs, but that somehow his life was going to be shaped by that. So I would characterize the state of our people in our region in that way.
We'll come back to that after I'll tell you. Talk about, for example, the peril idea, what's happening here. Amanda.
Great. Again, thank you for allowing me to be here, Mickey. This is such an honor, and I'm enjoying it so far. As was mentioned, I'm from Houston, and I serve on the city council. And I think Houston is a very unusual place. We are in a state that is extremely red or conservative, but we are a democratic city, if you will. And so the politics of the city versus the politics of the rest of the state seem to be quite different. And I think right now, in light of what's happening nationally with politics, I think that most of our Houstonians are really looking at city leadership to really put forth policy that makes a difference in their lives. They've seen oil prices drop. So Houston is the energy capital of the world, and we've been hovering at less than $50 a barrel, which is not good for the Houston economy. And so that part, which has been a mainstay, has been something that struggled. So there's question about what's going to happen with the future of our economy. And thankfully, we've got some really key opportunities. I started a technology and innovation task force. And in fact, this week we're making recommendations to the city, the mayor and the city council with respect to how to build a robust ecosystem for tech and innovation. We have a lot of investment in Houston and a lot of innovation, but not necessarily the venture capital startup community that Houston certainly has the potential to cultivate. So that's one area that there's a space for optimism in terms of building that arm of the economy. In addition, I think that people are starting to recognize that it's no longer feasible to continue to exist as if we're not interconnected or there's not connectivity between those who are the haves and have-nots. And so there's been an increased emphasis on how do we address or tackle some of the more challenging issues of our time in urban centers, such as the issue of equity or the issue of having such disparity between population. And so we've come up with an initiative called the Complete Communities Initiative, which seeks to, on a pilot level, address trying to provide revitalization tools to underserved neighborhoods, but letting those residents be the author of their own story, if you will, creating that vision, participating in the process, having buy-in so that they're not displaced once this investment comes into their community. And so this is an experiment that I think people are very optimistic about. We've had some significant financial challenges in our city from a fiscal management standpoint. We had unfunded pension liability of about $8 billion. And for the first time in 16 years, we've actually addressed it. And so people are very, very optimistic about policy coming out from the local government, and I do think that we'll continue to feed off of that. So it's allowed us to be a lot more effective.
Mayor?
Yes, well, good morning, Mickey, and to all of you. I'm Ashley Swearengin from Fresno, California. No longer the mayor. I joked with Mickey, I'm the only one up here that's not in office. I guess Mickey as well, so my filter is off. But I am actually
Actually, I never had a filter, so. Yeah.
I can say with authority that's true. I've heard you in closed session. So yeah, great to be with you guys this morning and just reflect on what's happening at the local level in a place like Fresno. Just to give you a little bit of background, so I'm closing in on 20 years of work at the community and economic development level in Fresno, 8 of those years serving as the strong mayor of Fresno, termed out in early January, and now head up our community foundation right in the middle of the state. And I love that so far what we've heard from the other speakers is at the local level, we do have a sense of optimism, while also, and maybe the way I would put it is we're optimistic, but we also have a sense of urgency that if we do not push really, really hard in the next 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, we will lose a window of momentum that in Fresno, it's taken us about 20 years to get to this point. So it is an optimistic and urgent sense of prioritizing our actions. And what makes things so interesting in my community, a couple of things. First of all, Fresno is actually quite a large city. It's the 5th largest in California, 550,000 people in the city of Fresno, about 750,000 in the metro area, and 1 million in the county. But when you're in the middle of the hugest state, in the nation, you often get overshadowed. And so there's this sense of isolation from other parts of the state that's really, for many, many decades, created a sense of pessimism. Nothing can ever go right here. We're always the stepbrother, the stepdaughter. And we did not have our own sense of destiny. So we really tried to combat that starting about 20 years ago. And it's taken a long time to peel back the layers. Fresno today, this is to me very, very remarkable. 59% of the residents of Fresno are under the age of 35. And it is a majority-minority community, with the majority population being Latino, 100 languages spoken in our large public school system, which has got 72,000 kids. So it is a young place. If you go to the mall or the movie theater or any place where you're seeing large crowds congregating, you look across the sea of people and you see it is young, ethnically diverse, and the fastest growing city in California. Okay, on top of all that, it is a city of chronic economic distress. Many decades ago, we would say, well, we're an ag economy, we have cyclical unemployment, and that's just kind of the way it goes. We have double-digit unemployment when the state is at 4 or 5%. That's no longer true today. Today, we actually have chronic double-digit unemployment, actually just dipped below double-digit for the first time without a housing boom this last year, so we're starting to see things go in the right direction. But it's a really complicated place, a place of big ideas that have failed for many, many years. So when I stepped in as mayor, a lot of my work was all about trying to take the rubble off the pile and help people see that we really did, in fact, have a hope and a future, and tackle some of the things that we had talked about for a long time, but that we weren't ever able to get done. Things like, and I'll just throw a couple of hot button issues for us that for a couple decades really divided our community. Right when I stepped into office, we really struggled with what to do with law enforcement and civilian oversight of law enforcement. After 20 years of debate, we adopted an Office of Independent Review that angered some, made others happy, but ultimately created a sense of accountability and transparency for law enforcement that was really important to disenfranchised communities. Dealt with an eyesore, an old ancient pedestrian mall in the middle of our downtown that really collapsed our downtown back in the 60s. That project is under construction today, and people have a sense of optimism that the urban core can make a comeback. One last kind of big thing, we've had on the books for, probably 20 years, a massive public infrastructure project to improve our surface water and really drought-proof our community. No elected official ever wanted to bring rate increases forward before. So we spent about 3 or 4 years, went through multiple lawsuits, a citizen petition to recall council members, all kinds of crazy things happened, but ultimately got that infrastructure project pushed through. And I think when you start to get some of those big things done that you've talked about for a long time as a community, that really is the source of the optimism that we're feeling. And to be honest, a lot of the tools that I needed back in my community to try to deal with bringing people together and really find a path forward on these complicated issues were really instilled in me through the Rodell program. So not to do a commercial here, but I mean, it really was a very significant, I think, influence in our ability to make some of these things happen in Fresno. I'll stop with that.
Good. Well, Bill, take a bow. But, so what I'm struck by, I want to pick up on something you said, see if Julie and Amanda look at the same way. The sense of urgency, that is this that you see a great need, but you also see a window closing, and that you've got limited amount of time. You know, you were talking about some real important changes internally. You've got an energy industry that, when you talk about a different mosaic, you know, I'm from Oklahoma, the difference of views on the energy industry and the pipelines and all that, you know, puts enormous pressure. I mean, do you all share this sense that it's on you a burden to move quickly to get some things done, or not?
I'll say this, one thing that is not on the optimistic side that we've had to take urgent action with is kind of the unfortunate entrance of politics into what's happening with immigration. Houston is the most diverse city in the country, and we have about 40% of our residents are Latino. And a lot of people are living in extreme fear, and it's become very disruptive in the school setting. It's become very unfortunate because there's been some recent passage of state law which indicates that if you are law enforcement officers and you're not enforcing basically federal immigration policy and law, you could be subject to civil penalty. It also could remove public elected officials from office should you pass policy that may be inconsistent with federal policy or somehow intervene in a way that may not be consistent with federal immigration policy. So it's created a big strain on our law enforcement community in terms of fear within that community, in terms of, well, what's going to happen with profiling and what's going to happen. There are a litany of things that people just have a lot of uncertainty about. And so what we've had to act urgently about is that particular state law. It hasn't taken effect, but we voted last week actually to sue the state of Texas because that law is not tenable, and we don't think that that's going to create an environment that continues to allow our residents to thrive. And so that's one action of urgency that we didn't anticipate having to take, but in being responsive to the needs of the people, we've had to make a decision about that quickly.
In terms of urgency, I don't know that we feel the sense of urgency to build on things that are, or the opportunities that are going to be closed forever. But I think that what we're seeing is that there's such extreme swings. So especially in the energy industry, it's like all or nothing. There's not a lot in the middle. Either you think, you know, you can safely frack and you can develop these gas and oil resources, or there should be zero fracking. Well, there's billions of dollars of investments between those two extremes. And so for states like North Dakota, Oklahoma, Texas, that are even California, big energy producers, it's a very troublesome place to be in when you're looking at the size of investments that are at risk if the pendulum swings significantly quickly in another direction. So that's a big concern for us, and we've seen that, you know, after years of building. Now the price dropped, and we've experienced that a lot in the agriculture sector, so we're familiar with that, but have a lot more investments in housing and infrastructure and those sorts of things at risk with those kinds of extremes.
One thing I was struck by, I didn't think about it until I was hearing actually what Amanda and Ashley were saying, and that is, I don't know how much it affects North Dakota, but Ashley's a Republican in a Democratic state, and Amanda is a Democrat in a Republican state. And there is, so sometimes the mosaic and the different narratives, the different perspectives are playing out at home too. This is not just like New York, Boston, and the Bay Area against, you know, what's out there, you know. So how do you manage this? How do you manage this being, as you said, you're the kind of the stepchild in.
So, boy, that's a good question. We could spend the rest of the week talking about that. So, working at the local level, like Amanda and I do, we have the benefit of running in a nonpartisan seat. And I don't know if that's the same for you, Julie. So, you're okay. So really, from and I didn't serve in elected office before running for mayor, so I didn't have experience in partisan politics. And I actually believed people when they said they just want me to do what I thought was best for Fresno. I thought they were being truthful about that. And then I did, and then it turns out they kind of got mad at me. I'll never forget in 2011, and again, just think of Fresno has had this chronic feeling of stepchild, nobody cares, it's up to us, no one's gonna come rescue us. And when I ran in 2008, there was actually a pretty good momentum with the Republican governor, Arnold Schwarzenegger, and the previous mayor started working pretty closely together, and all of a sudden Fresno was kind of starting to get some attention from the state capitol, and I had people asking me, a lot of voters asking me, like, are you going to make sure that we get help from Sacramento and DC if you're elected mayor? And absolutely, that's what I'm going to do. We need as many resources and help as we can get at the local level. And I thought that's what people wanted me to do. So turns out President Obama was elected in 2008, same day I was. So there's a Democrat administration in DC. I'm back in January, right out of the gate for U.S. Conference of Mayors, and starting to work hard to get to know people in this new administration and see how we could bridge the divides and get resources to Fresno. Long story, just a little bit longer, that resulted in Fresno being selected as one of 6 cities in the country to participate in the White House's signature domestic policy initiative called Strong Cities, Strong Communities. They picked 6 cities. Those cities got federal employees embedded in our communities, and their job was to make sure that the federal-local partnership worked well, and that whatever our agendas were at the local level, the federal government was doing everything possible to make that happen. Sounds like a dream come true, right? So we worked hard. We probably spent 18 months lobbying for this. We found out we were going to get it. We were so excited. It was July 2011. These federal officials come to Fresno. It's not exactly a great time to be in Fresno in July, by the way. So these people come out in their black wool suits, and they're at this press event sweating bullets, and like, here we are from the Obama administration, and we're here to help. And you would not believe the explosion of talk radio that day. For days and days and days after, my own mother, whom I love and is, an amazing woman who listens to these talk radio stations, called me up and she said, Ashley, I just want you to know it's okay if you made a mistake. You're not the first mayor to make a mistake partnering with the Democrat White House. I'm like, what are you talking about? I heard the federal government is taking over the city. No, that's not at all what's going on. I mean, it just got so blown up, and I really was stunned that after spending years of Fresno saying we need help, it turns out when you're coming from a partisan mindset, you will only receive help if it's coming from the person or the party that you think it should come from. And what a huge mistake to operate a community that way, right? And so I decided early on, like, if somebody's offering help, I don't care where it's coming from, if it's genuinely going to benefit the residents of Fresno, I'm saying yes to that. And that started me down a path of, tripping wires all the time with Republicans and Democrats. But after about, 8 years of that, I think it's a proven model, and obviously would not suggest leading in any other way.
And I would say it's actually been quite liberating to be in a nonpartisan position because, as was mentioned by Ashley, it is very challenging, I think, to have to operate in only colors of red and blue and not just think about what's the best outcome for the residents that you're supposed to be serving. And so if you look at some of the major initiatives that we've passed, you really would not be able to tell because, again, a lot of the major stuff we've passed have been with unanimous consent, 16-0 votes. I mean, pretty bipartisan activity, and based on the types of activity and initiatives that we've pushed forward, you really wouldn't be able to tell who's at the helm, an R or a D. And that's been very liberating. I mean, with the exception of maybe the past vote that I just mentioned to you, it's really been liberating. So we've got a Democratic mayor who has put forth one of the most extensive pension solutions ever, and that's not traditionally viewed as something the Democratic mayor would take up in his first term, but did. And so we've just got an ability with the nonpartisan platform to really push forward. It doesn't mean that there's never an instance where politics come or infiltrate what we do at City Hall, but certainly it's not the norm just to have politics or red or blue dictate everything that we're doing. And it's been very liberating to be able to have more of a focus on policy making, more of a focus on serving the needs of the community rather than just the politics of the day.
And do you have that same kind of challenge? Or?
Mine is slightly different, but it is similar in that my role, I'm a regulator. So I regulate utility companies, we regulate energy companies who want permits, and I'm a Republican, and in a very strongly Republican state. And so while I don't, operating as a regulator, I think I have a responsibility to hold companies responsible to meet really high standards, and I expect them to do that. And so that has put me at odds with some in my party who think that, you know, pro-business, just anything goes. And I just insist that companies can and should be held to high standards, not only for the public's benefit, but for their own benefit, because they operate with a license to serve, and they need to have the public trust. And so I have taken that role pretty seriously, and have put me at odds with some of the folks in my party. But I think over time, and I think that what you've asked here, Mickey, is one of the challenges, the biggest challenges in serving in America today, is trying to get things done, move forward, do things that make sense and are pragmatic and will serve the public in a favorable fashion, in a highly charged political atmosphere. And so so you really can't please anybody. And I think ultimately, as soon as leaders decide that the goal isn't to please everybody, it's to serve the public, that's what's liberating. And I think that's why mayors and folks at the local level, that's where government is its best. And so many good things can happen because you are serving the public. People expect to have their garbage picked up, so you have to figure out a way to do it. People expect to have water. They expect to have, you know, roads that function, and street lights, and cops, and fire protection. All these things that really matter on a daily basis. So it isn't as partisan an environment in which to serve. And so I try to bring that same perspective in North Dakota with 750,000 people in our whole state. It's kind of like a small city, just stretched over many, 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 many miles.
I want to add something there. We're going to come to you all soon, but I wasn't going to throw myself in here, but I'm just going to say with this one thing. I don't see a lot of millennials in this audience, but I was talking to a group the other day who were talking about these problems, and who mentioned that millennials actually look at everything as sort of a la carte. They don't take things as a whole. And I gave a talk, my wife actually heard me do this, gave a talk at a conference the other day in which I predicted, and I do predict, that 20 or 30 years from now, people are going to look back at the fact that we tried to govern ourselves by dividing into different political parties, and they're going to think, what the hell were you thinking? And that the party system is going to disappear. So anyway, that's, you know, I can't make it happen, but that's kind of what I think. So let me just ask you, I can't get past this idea of a child worrying about the opioids and drugs and this kind of thing that's affecting the community. But it doesn't seem to be something that is drawing the kind of funding and attention that I would think it would be getting from the federal government. Certainly it is pretty far down the list of the things that we're reading about what's happening in Washington. So if I ask you, what are the real challenges? Maybe that's one of them, but if you listed the top 2 or 3 challenges in your community, and not just in you doing your job, but your neighbors, the people you represent, you work with, and all that, I don't know if it would be the same as you'd see on the front page of the New York Times or the Washington Post. What are, in your communities, the big things on people's minds they're really concerned about?
I'll jump in on that and just say, so Fresno is 110 square miles. for 60 years. Our growth pattern, well, we back up, food capital of the world. If you eat something tasty today, it probably came from Fresno. All of the wonderful packaged almonds and pistachios you see around Fresno, or the Valley, I should say, Bakersfield, we'll throw them in there. Anyway, so that's my part of the world, major ag region, flat, cheap land surrounding Fresno. So it was very, very easy to convert that flat, cheap land to another subdivision, another subdivision, another subdivision, another subdivision. We did that for 60 years. Meanwhile, we did not have the employment base, the export-oriented employment base, to take care of what was being left behind. And so when a neighborhood started showing its wear and tear a little bit, maybe it got, a little bit impoverished looking, people who could get out of that neighborhood just got out and did that very, very aggressively to the extent that it's probably one of the most sprawling cities in the nation, or certainly in the top 10. So what we did over the last 60 years is we inadvertently created now the second highest concentration of poverty of any other large city in the United States. We were number 1, now we're number 2. So I take full credit for that, but I'm not sure if maybe number 1 just got worse. But anyway, so really, really, really distinct line in the sand, line in the city, people living above this line, discretionary income, below don't have discretionary income. So, and when you look at a map of the city, 2/3 of the southern half are census tracts that have either high poverty or extreme poverty. All right, that is an enormous lift when you don't have an economic base to fuel income levels to start to turn around those neighborhoods. It is an impossible task, except we're going after it, and we have for 20 years, and things are starting to move in the right direction. What we're now learning about toxic shock, about what happens when you're born into a disadvantaged neighborhood. If you're a person of color, a low-income person, born into a single-family household or some combination of those factors, it is extremely difficult to get out of those circumstances, almost impossible. And that literally the very environment you're born into, there's a low level of constant stress and trauma that child is experiencing. So our mission is to turn that around. We rotted out our schools. I mean, we just really decimated a city. So now our pursuit is to reverse that. I would say, Mickey, that's a long answer to your question. What is our top thing that we're wrestling with? And I'm not saying it's the headline every day, because it's such a long-standing chronic issue, you just get used to it. So a big part of our work has been to remind people, guys, this isn't okay. It's not normal. We shouldn't have the second highest concentration of poverty. We shouldn't have half the educational attainment that other places do in California. So we've had to actually work as a civic sector to keep putting that back front and center, but now we're getting the momentum to move big pieces of policy and programs to make a difference there. Closely related to that is joblessness and employment. So probably more just the day-to-day. What are people thinking about, talking about, worried about? It's a source of income and stabilizing their families.
Yeah. Wow.
I also hail from a city where education is a challenge and poverty is also a challenge. We are about 650 square miles, so slightly sprawled. 2.3 million people inside the city limits, about 5.5 million in the metro area. Very large city, but a small contingent of that city actually is really adding a lot of tax-based support, and the rest, a significant portion of the city is not. So you have a lot of communities and families where there are low-income households, and the school districts in which the schools that they attend also are challenged. And so we are facing a situation where we don't have a comprehensive solution as it relates to education, but that is going to be the workforce of the future. So if you think that it doesn't affect you and you're someone who has a life of privilege or runs a corporation, it does, because this is the workforce that will be part of the workforce that helps your business thrive or your city thrive, or it will not. And we know that when you have extreme poverty, crime does result. And so in one way or another, it's going to connect, everybody is going to be connected to that issue. And so imparting that message has been something that as a city, not necessarily city government, but as a city we've tried to do. We've had a lot of academicians like Professor Steven Kleinberg, who educates people on that issue. So education is a big issue. For us, housing is a big issue. Because of the fact that people are now wanting to stop taking an hour and a half commute across town or to the suburb where they reside, they're coming back into the city, it's driving the prices of housing up, and it's gentrifying our inner core of the neighborhood. So you have residents who have been longstanding residents in a lower income area who suddenly cannot afford the taxes to stay there, so they're being displaced. And so addressing the issue of gentrification, we're attempting to do that with our Complete Communities initiative, although right now it's on a pilot basis. We want to make sure that when you revitalize a neighborhood, you do so responsibly and not necessarily just displace residents because you've got some developers who are interested in a particular parcel. And in Houston, we don't have zoning, so that further exacerbates this issue of property concerns and also gentrification. In addition to that, people are very concerned about the immigration issue, as I mentioned. People are very fearful, and as I mentioned, the Latino population is the largest plurality in our city. And so you've got a lot of fear, not necessarily because everyone is undocumented, but because are they going to be profiled? And that's a very, very real fear for a lot of people. And so that's an issue we've been dealing with. And then finally, law enforcement as a whole. We are understaffed, if you will, in terms of our law enforcement community, and to finance staffing up the needs just to get to the minimum level would cost several millions and millions of dollars that we do not have access to. And so, you know, you have a desire from residents to have responsiveness at a certain level, but it's very hard to do that when you don't have enough law enforcement officers. And so we've had the challenge of trying to reallocate resources and you know, squeeze blood out of turnips a little bit as a city government. But that's also a challenge that I think, depending on where you live as well, is probably a kitchen table discussion.
Yeah.
And in North Dakota, I think our biggest concern is sustainability. It might not be, you know, it comes out in different ways in different families, whether it's economics or where their kids are going to work or how they're going to pay for college education and those sorts of things. But how do we sustain a bright future in our state that's so dependent on economies that swing significantly? As a sleeping giant, I think, in North Dakota and in Texas and California, I think everywhere, a sleeping giant is addiction. And whether it's drugs or alcohol, or you cannot move forward and tackle the problems of economics and homelessness and getting people sustainable jobs and incomes and a quality of life that they're due if they aren't healthy. And there is a huge addiction problem. I just came back from California on Saturday night and then flew out here on Sunday. We were in, not in Fresno, I've got Fresno on my mind, Venice. And I was stunned by the homelessness, absolutely sickened. And leaving one of the nicest neighborhoods out of a fancy bar where everyone was spending $15 on a drink and literally stepping over a homeless person who was face first on the ground. And everyone was doing it. Walking down the street, buying a $15 ice cream cone. I mean, how is this possible to have that huge disparity in income levels and then driving up 20 minutes into Beverly Hills and seeing people that clearly were looking for ways to spend money? It's just, I couldn't live there. God bless you. I could not live in California.
Just to be clear,
I know that.
I don't live there.
Sounds like you're doing awesome things in Fresno.
It's a little ways away from there.
Well, I'm going to turn to the audience now, see if but I wanted to kind of, I think this applies to what you all said, and it's back to something that Ashley said. When you said, guys, that's not normal. And so you wonder how many things are so endemic, have been around for so long, problems that have been so persistent that we become accustomed to it, and we don't stop and say, wait a minute, that's not right. And they just, problems that can be solved that we don't turn our attention to because we have just become numb almost to it. We don't see it. So that, wow. So questions. We have somebody with a microphone. And anybody? Yeah, right down here, right in front. Microphone's coming down here because this is going to be available on. I doubt if any of you have computers, but if you are, you find it.
Thank you very much. It's great to hear this kind of fresh and optimistic point of view from three talented professionals. My question is, when you think about the big issues that you've all mentioned, immigration, education, healthcare, and the opioid epidemic, in the context of what's happening in Washington, and think about that for another 3.5 years at least, is that going to be a help or a hindrance in what you're doing? And if it's either way, how are you going to either leverage the help or deal with the hindrance?
I'll take that first. You know, so far there have been a number of issues that we've attempted to tackle, and so far we've seen some negative impact coming out of Washington. So for example, if you're thinking about the issue of homelessness, right? The goal of homelessness is not just to have a different aesthetic and move someone somewhere that you can't see. The goal is to move someone into permanent supportive housing. But if you have HUD freezing housing vouchers, how do you do that? And that's the question we're looking at on the ground, trying to solve some very complicated problems that have been longstanding in most of our cities or communities. And so you've got to have at your disposal all resources possible. We need to coordinate with HUD. We need to coordinate with our state. Mental health is an issue that also intersects the issue of homelessness. How are we increasing our resources that are being devoted toward mental health? That's a big challenge that for decades and decades you've seen neglected on a state level in many places. It's not just in Texas. And so I see that right now we're not coordinated in the way that cities need, because we've got to have support coming from different directions. And it certainly is not the time for, at least in the city context, to cut off CDBG funds when the issue of housing is so prevalent in most American cities, especially urban cities, right? And so it's very inconsistent with some of the needs that we have and face. I think possibly educating and demonstrating how these things have positive results is one way, but unfortunately, I think the way that will probably result, I hope not, but could be the negative results. So the closing of certain places and the negative implications. Unfortunately, sometimes that's the thing that gets the attention of the media. That's the thing that gets the attention of an office holder when they see their standing going down in terms of public opinion. And unfortunately, I think that's part of what's going to end up happening if those cuts, if those cuts continue in the direction that they seem to be heading.
From my perspective, I can't speak to some of the social issues and the direct implication to cities. I can see how those would be a big challenge with the current administration. However, from an energy sector side of things, the Trump administration has backed off on some things that were pretty threatening that were coming out of the Obama administration previously. And for agriculture as well, you've got the waters of the U.S., you've got some of the surface mining regulations that were kind of a one-size-fits-all for the nation when it really didn't apply to our state, but would have pretty much shut down some of the programs. So the more state-by-state approach is something that North Dakota has pushed for a long time. Let us do it. We care about our environment. We care about sustainability. We want to do it right. We will do it right. We have a record of doing it right. Let us do it. And that's an attitude that is much more favored by the Trump administration. And so from that standpoint, that gives us the opportunity to build on the energy resources that we have, that the whole country needs, that are a vital part of economic growth and stability long-term for every community in our country. So from that standpoint, this administration is going to be helpful for our state.
just keep my answers brief. These two ladies are in office having to deal with this day to day. I get to be on the sidelines kind of observing right now. But the one good thing I would say about being an under the radar major American city that probably has been neglected for a long time by its states and in the nation's capital is that you learn that you're not going to get anything out of DC and you have to do it yourself. And so I think built into the fabric of the civic DNA in Fresno is a sense of civic entrepreneurship that we have to solve the problems ourselves. We're not going to find the resources in other places. So that, I would say, has developed a pretty lean civic machine in Fresno. Having said that, it is very real. To be mayor and to hear that my CDBG, Community Development Block Grant money, is a federal grant program that's block granted to communities based on a number of factors, and it's pretty flexible dollars. And so for those to go away or be substantially cut, I mean, honestly, that is a huge challenge. So I don't mean to suggest by any stretch that it's not a really difficult thing at the ground level right now for cities dealing with the budget that we're seeing. But there's always a way. I mean, I'll just real quick on housing, for example. We never got enough housing dollars from the feds anyway. So it actually pushed us to try to look at creating our own affordable housing trust fund that's going to be funded. By the way, watch national philanthropy. I see them moving into spaces where the federal government has kind of backed off and backed out of, and we're starting to see major investments, program-related, mission-related, millions and millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars into designated places, I think because there's this sense that the federal government is backing away from some of these priorities. So we'll go after some of those sorts of dollars to fund things that maybe historically federal grant dollars would fund.
I'm not going to let you get away with this thing about, well, you're on the sidelines. Ashley is a Republican in one of the most heavily Democratic states in the country. She got almost 47% running statewide, and she's going to be back. So, yes, back here, all the way to the back.
Hi, I am from California, but thank God I get to live here half the year. One of the topics that all of you have to face in the cities and in the states is education, and it's been the long-term problem, maybe not since 1950 and maybe even the beginning of 60, but it certainly has in the last 4 or 5 decades, and certainly worse in urban areas than it has been in the outside of the urban areas. Why do we want anybody from Washington telling you how to educate your children? You're working in cities and you're working in states, and the ability to control how you get funding and how you get to use your dollars and how do you get to educate your children seems to be oxymoronic to a certain extent for somebody on a local level, because that's where the issue has to be, whether it's with teachers or facilities or something else. Yeah. And it's the longest term problem, yeah. And it's the longest, and to me, it's probably one of the biggest problems in the future.
Okay, well, let's give them a chance to address it.
I'd like to take a stab at that. So I'm a product of public school in Houston in an urban school district. And I live in a state where there is a very lively debate about whether there's value in providing support for preschool education. And as we know, the words that children are exposed to at the ages of 3 and 4 and the vocabulary they build are such fundamental aspects to their ability and propensity to succeed as students throughout their educational process. So for us to cut back and think that it's okay that we leave it in the hands of individuals to educate our children presupposes and assumes a lot. It assumes that you have parents in the household who are able to work with the children and teach them how to read and how to do certain things outside of the classroom setting. But when you have parents in households that are not having sustainable wages, it's very difficult for parents to do that. That may not be the value system in that particular household. There are a litany of confounding variables that impact a child's ability to succeed. So in my environment, it certainly is a space where we need as much support as possible. And in the state of Texas, unfortunately, I think the children are suffering as a result of the political discourse that's happening today.
And I would say you just made a great argument for local control because those issues can be best addressed with solutions that come from the local school board. Maybe there needs to be federal funding or state funding to support it, and in North Dakota, all the states are, the schools receive almost 100% state funding that is budgeted at the local level. Because you have to, one size fits all doesn't work. It just doesn't. It doesn't work for a country this size. It doesn't probably work for a city. You have to be able to tailor the programs to fit the issues where they are. And I think you end up just wasting resources. You'd send stuff to North Dakota that we don't need, but we'll take it. It could be better used in your community. So I just think local control, especially when it comes to schools, is just absolutely vital.
And I just want to respond to that really quickly. In our state, we have school funding law that actually takes from a lot of urban school districts and distributes the property tax basically to other school districts. So if you live in an urban setting, they call it a Robin Hood law. You basically are penalized, even though you're in a low income area and your school is low income, because you're in a city that has corporations, for example, then you're considered to be a property wealthy district. And so then their money is taken out of your school district and distributed across the state in more rural environments. And what has happened is, even though you have a situation where the school boards want to do certain things, if you don't have the funding to do it, you can't create the funding. You're not going to, you have a charter school movement happening, but what's going to happen with the rest of the school districts that are public school districts where their parents haven't taken them out of the public school? And where's our plan for success there? And you have to have a plan for success. You can have plans all day, but until it's funded, you're not going to have the ability to succeed.
I think this is a great conversation, and totally agree. Like the school conversation, it's a state-local conversation, period. There is in my observation and experience working alongside major K-12 reformers for the last 10 years, that reform is driven at the local level and the state level. And so I think it's a good example of sometimes one of those places where we kind of get up on a pillar and fight about a concept. It really doesn't matter, to be honest with you. What's happening to change schools for the better is going to happen at the local level, period. Even with perfect policy passed at the local level, even then it's almost impossible to see the real lift that we want to see in our major school districts. So I would say distraction, get back to work, fix the schools. It's happening at the local level.
Well, I think we've got time for one more question. We got 7 minutes and 4 seconds to go. There's back here, right there in the corner.
Yeah, I'm from New Orleans, and we have our own school problems as well. But we continue to agree that education is one of the biggest problems in our country. And we continue to force children to try to go to college who are not prepared to go to college. And they end up not graduating and with student loans that they can't ever hope to repay. What do you think about VOTEC schools and encouraging people to get meaningful, well-paying jobs rather than going to college?
Oh.
I'll take that.
Yeah.
I love VOTEC schools, and if you graduate, come to North Dakota. We need you. There's a lot of jobs for people with 2-year college degrees. We're almost 100% employment in our state. And I agree with you. There's so much focus on a 4-year college degree when you can get a commercial driver's license and pass a drug test, and you can make $80 an hour. And so I think that there should be more education done to young people about some of these other opportunities in non-4-year areas that really can provide a great quality of life for long term.
I think it's important that when we think about meeting people where they are and the wide variety of different educational manifestations that might take, thinking about it for the economy of the future, right? So we have a disconnect happening in our country right now in terms of where our economy has evolved and where people are comfortable in terms of what types of jobs they want to seek, right? And we've seen that play out in the presidential election in 2015 and 16. And I think what we have to do, if you're talking about a community college or if you're talking about vocational training, whatever you're talking about shouldn't be the technology or the training of today. It should be training you so that you're ready for the job of tomorrow, so that you can have a sustainable path forward. And I think having various pathways for upward mobility in a variety of ways, some of that might actually be relating to labor, it might be relating to something else, but making sure that when you do that, you're training them for that technology or that development for that industry for tomorrow, so that they won't be displaced or out of a job in a few years because they've been trained in a way that's outdated. And I think that's really important for us to think about as policymakers, but also as educators as well.
So just to wrap this up in a bow with our remaining time. So great point, totally agree with your concept, but I would add to that and challenge us to consider that with the aging out of the baby boomer population and the graying of the workforce, we actually do have a tremendous demand for people with bachelor's degrees as well. So in California, it's estimated, I mean, there's some millions of jobs that are going to be available or vacant in the next, 3 to 5 years, 5 to 10 years, because of the aging of the workforce. So another example of how we cannot be stuck with the tyranny of the or. It's either vocational education or pursuing college track. It really has to be a both and. And jumping back to the earlier question, really strategies for accomplishing that sort of human capital pipeline that a regional economy is going to need has to happen at the local and the regional level. So in Fresno, for example, that's the work we're taking on right now, is looking at what are we going to need over the next 10 years, 20 years? How can we make sure that people get from middle school to high school to some sort of training beyond high school, and training that potentially leads to a bachelor's degree, depending on their skills and aptitudes and interests, and kind of doing that both and approach. So that would be my final comment, is just, there's so many things in which we get embroiled in this discussion, this battle over it's either this or that. In almost every case where you find those kinds of arguments going on, in my experience, it's really a both and you just have to kind of take a step back and look at things differently.
I don't know how you feel, but I get asked a lot about how optimistic or pessimistic I am about America's future. And people watch what happens in my old haunting grounds, Congress, and they get discouraged and they say, there's no leadership and so forth. And our program, the Rodell program that the Aspen Institute has put together, now has some 300 fellows like these three. And so when you cannot sit here and listen to Julie and Amanda and Ashley and not feel good about what's in America. Washington is not America. Washington's a piece of it, but this is the piece that makes me very proud and makes me very encouraged. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.